have been a naturalist and a wildlife photographer in South Central Alaska for the last 6 or so years. I am originally from Homer, and I've worked for several years on whale watching boats in Kachemak Bay. And I hold a marine biology degree from the University of Alaska Southeast. And a lot of the work that I've done here in Alaska has focused on humpback whales and killer whales. And I've also done some field work with them in Norway as well. And so for tonight's presentation, I want to focus on two things. I want to focus on the technique of photo identification and how scientists use that to study whale populations. And I also want to touch on community science and how you can get involved in whale research, even if you're not a scientist. So we'll jump right into it. So to start out with, what is photo identification? So essentially, this is the practice of photographing the markings on individual whales in order to identify them. And this can be done with virtually any species of whale or dolphin. And the two species that we'll talk about tonight are the humpback whale and the killer whale. So this is an example of a photo ID shot for a humpback whale. And these are the flukes of the whale. So when a humpback whale is going on a dive, they typically will lift their tail up out of the water, and they'll give you a nice, if they're cooperating, they'll give you a nice look on the underside of that tail fluke. And every single humpback whale has a unique tail fluke. These markings that you see, they're unique to every whale. They're essentially the whale version of a fingerprint. No two are alike, and the patterns and the pigmentation are consistent across time. So once a whale is about a year or so old, the pigmentation pattern on its fluke is set for life. Now, it may pick up other markings like scars from things like barnacles or even killer whale attacks, but the pigmentation pattern itself generally doesn't change. And so this is what scientists will photograph when they're out in the field trying to identify these whales. Now, for killer whales, it's a little bit different. They don't lift their flukes when they dive, and so we have to use another part of their body to identify them. So for killer whales, what scientists use is a photograph of the dorsal fin and the saddle patch. And the saddle patch is that gray area right underneath the dorsal fin. And just like the fluke of a humpback whale, that pigmentation pattern is unique to every single orca. And it might be covered in scars, it might have a different kind of pigmentation pattern on it, but each one is distinguishable from another. And the dorsal fins can also be used as well. The shape, the size, and occasionally killer whales, they'll get nicks and tears in the fin, and that helps with the identification as well. So why use photo ID? One, it's non-invasive. You don't have to physically restrain the animal. You don't have to touch it or do anything to it. And essentially, it's very hands-off. Really, all you need is access to a boat or sometimes just land. There are land-based areas where you can view whales and photograph them as well. And it's relatively inexpensive. Field research can get quite expensive depending on what you're trying to do. And for photo ID work, all you really need is a decent camera with a telephoto lens. And even today, some cell phone cameras can even capture photos that are pretty good. And so this is pretty cheap, and a lot of people are able to do it on their own time. And it creates really valuable data sets, and these can span decades. So back in the 70s, when whale research was really getting started, some of the whales that they were photographing using photo ID back then are still being seen today. And so that's decades of data that scientists can collect on individual whales. And photo ID can also help provide insight into individual whale behavior, their relationships with one another, and their movement over time. When you can identify an animal as an individual and have resightings of that over a time period, you can really get a good idea of how that individual animal is behaving and what it's up to. So this is an example that I like to use. Killer whales, they were first really intensely studied in the early 70s along the coast of Washington and British Columbia, and then later in Alaska in the 80s. And by using photo ID, scientists have they can basically recreate family trees of these killer whales. And in certain populations on the West Coast and in Alaska, pretty much every individual in these killer whale populations are known. And so you can get a really good idea of how they're related to one another. So this example comes from a photo ID catalog, which I'll touch on in a little bit about what that is. It comes from a catalog of West Coast transient killer whales. And this is just a small family tree. So at the top, we have the matriarch, the grandma killer whale, essentially, her two daughters, and then her daughter's offspring. And without photo ID, we wouldn't be able to do this. We wouldn't be able to identify these individuals and track their family history. And so that gives us a much greater understanding of these animals' lives and their behavior. So how do you actually identify them? How do you make a match? So we'll start with humpback whales. This is a photo of a humpback whale that I took a couple of years ago in Kachemak Bay, where I was working. And in Kachemak Bay, there is a photo identification catalog that contains several hundred individual humpback whales that have been seen in Kachemak Bay and the lower Cook Inlet area. And this is just a little snapshot of that. And this catalog is maintained by Ginger Moore, and it's been maintained for over 20 years, I think now. But when you're looking at your field photo, a photo of a whale that you've taken out in the ocean, and you want to see if you can match it to a known whale, you would start flipping through a catalog and trying to see if you can match it. So if we take a look at this group of whales right here, we can see some of them clearly aren't a match. But if we look a little bit closer, this one right here, we can see that these look pretty similar. On the right side of the fluke, we have that black pigmentation right there. And on the left side, there's an X-shaped marking on that fluke. And so that's a pretty good indication that this is a match. This is the same whale. Now you might be wondering why the photo on the left looks a little bit more yellow. Sorry, the photo on the right, why it looks a little bit more yellow than the photo on the left. And the yellow coloration you see on the photo on the right is not actually pigmentation. That yellow color is actually a thin layer of algae that live on the fluke of this humpback whale. And these algae aren't permanent. You know, whales shed their skin. And so over time, the layer of algae is going to be different. So in the right photo, this whale, who we call Pirate in Homer, she has a lot of algae growth on her flukes. But in the photo I took on the left, we can see there's very little. So when you're trying to make a match, you want to make sure that you're looking at the actual pigmentation or natural markings on the animal, because we don't use the algae layer as a trait that we look at. So for killer whales, this photo I took earlier this year in Kenai Fjords National Park. This is an adult male killer whale. And this is another example of a photo ID catalog. And the killer whales around southern Alaska are studied by the North Gulf Oceanic Society. They maintain a great photo identification catalog, and you can actually view these all on their website. So if you're interested, I highly encourage that you go check that out. But when we're looking at killer whales, again, we want to look at that saddle patch and that dorsal fin. So if we start looking at this, we can see, oops. We can take a look at this male. We can see the dorsal fin shape is pretty similar. It doesn't really match the shape of this other adult male in the group. And if we look even closer, we can see that this is definitely a match. This whale has a small notch on its fin in the same spot. And so this is actually an adult male killer whale known as Skana. And this whale and the rest of his family group, they're often seen in the Seward area in the early spring or the late spring and early summer. And actually this year they were seen pretty consistently out of Homer, which is a little bit unusual. But if we keep looking at these two photos, there's something else that you might notice. In my photo that I took earlier this year, there are 3 new scars on the saddle patch that aren't present in the photo from the catalog, which was taken last year. And Over time, killer whales and other cetaceans, they can accumulate scars on their body from interacting or having aggressive encounters with other animals. And so these 3 scars, they're new and they're probably going to be permanent. So that's another trait that this whale can be identified with in the future. So photo ID catalogs, I've mentioned them a couple times. They're kind of like a whale yearbook. These catalogs are often specific to a certain population or a certain region, and they contain photos of all of the whales that scientists have documented. And depending on the scope of them, they can be quite large. So for example, in Kachemak Bay, just outside of Homer, that catalog has over 400 individuals. I think it's approaching, if it not hit 500 individuals at this point. Down in Southeast Alaska, that catalog has almost 2,000 individuals in it, and these are humpback whale ID catalogs. And if we hop on over to the North Atlantic, that catalog has 8,000 individuals in it. So imagine for a second, you go out, you take a photo of a humpback whale somewhere in the North Atlantic, and you really want to know if somebody else has seen that whale. If you were to sit down and flip through a catalog with 8,000 different photos of humpback whales in it, you can imagine it would take a very, very long time and it would be very tedious. So is there a better way to do this? Is there a better method or platform that can be used to identify whales? And the answer is yes. So that brings us to the community science platform of Happy Whale. And Happy Whale is a website where you can upload your photos of whales, whether they be humpback whales or killer whales, and they will be identified and matched to known whales if possible. And so this was a platform started, I believe it was 2015. And while it's primarily oriented around humpback whales, it has expanded in recent years to include things like killer whales, fin whales, and even some pinnipeds, seals and sea lions as well. So here's a quick rundown of how it works. Step 1, you're going to want to go photograph a whale. Or if you already have photographs on hand from past whale watching trips or past whale encounters, you can use those as well. You can make a free account on Happy Whale. Anybody can sign up for it, and it's really easy to use. And it will prompt you and direct you on how to upload your photo. And so once you've uploaded it to the website, it will match your whale to an existing whale that's already in the database that other people have documented and uploaded, or it will determine that the whale is new to science. And then this is the fun part. Once you've uploaded your whale photos and your whales have been identified as individuals, you will continue to get updates on where your whale has been seen. So anytime somebody uploads sightings of that particular whale, you'll get an email about it. And this is true for encounters that might happen after you saw the whale, and also for past encounters that might have occurred, a decade ago. And so it's pretty fun to be able to see where the whales that you've seen, where they've been going and what they've been up to. So this is an example of what a profile looks like on Happy Whale. So this is mine. And you can see on the map, I have most of my sightings and encounters are focused around the Gulf of Alaska, which is where I've done most of my work, but also some in Southeast Alaska and Norway as well. And each profile, you can zoom in and out of this map, and you can get a more detailed look at some of the sightings that you have. So if we look a little bit closer, the bulk of my sightings are out of Homer, of course, as that's where I've spent several years working. And when the farther you zoom in on these encounters, you get a better idea of what they are. So each of these circles and numbers represent an individual whale that I saw and documented. And the line across the screen over here, we can see that I saw 2 killer whales in the Kenai fjords area. And that line indicates that those whales then traveled over to Kachemak Bay. Now, it's not saying that they grew legs and crawled across land and went over to Homer. It just indicates that these whales did move over to that region. The actual route they take, who knows? They're not tagged. And these are some examples of what the email notifications look like that you'll get once your whale has been seen by other people. So the first one is a humpback whale named Flame, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And so I saw this humpback in 2017 in Juneau, and then somebody else saw it again this year in July. And then the second one is an example of what it looks like for killer whales. So that's a killer whale that I saw in 2018, and then somebody else saw it again last year. And when you click on these, it takes you to that newer or sometimes older encounter, so you can get more information about that particular encounter, maybe see some new photos. And Happy Whale is a really great community science platform, and how it actually does this is it uses an algorithm. It's an award-winning algorithm, and right now it's specific to humpback whales, but perhaps in the future it might be expanded to other species as well. And this algorithm has a 99% success rate in identifying and matching whales. And that's actually much higher than just an average person like you or me trying to do it. And it's also much, much faster. So it can match whales in 1/40th of the amount of time that it would take you or me to do the same thing. And the data on Happy Whale, it can be shared with researchers all around the world. Anybody can pull up Happy Whale and take a look at some of the sightings that are on there. And it's a great database if you're looking to do some research. And this is one of my favorite things. Happy Whale has 60,000 individual humpback whales in its database. And that's just humpback whales. That's not any of the other species that are on there. So if you thought that 8,000 individual catalog was large, imagine 60,000 whales in pictures you would have to go through. And bringing it back a little bit closer to home here in Alaska, 95% of all of the humpback whales that are found in Southeast Alaska are documented on Happy Whale. At this point, the only new whales that are being documented through Happy Whale are usually calves or juveniles. And so these are whales that are born in the last year or so that just haven't been found yet. And so if you go out on a whale watching boat or just on your own boat out and about in Southeast Alaska and you see a humpback whale and you take a photo of it and you upload it to Happy Whale, odds are you're going to get a notification about it and you're going to be able to figure out exactly who that whale is. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about killer whales. But before we get into killer whales and how they work with Happy Whale, we kind of have to do a little bit of an ecotype crash course. And I could do a whole presentation on just killer whale ecotypes because they are just the most interesting things, in my opinion. But we'll keep it simple. So not all killer whales are the same. Around the world, there's about a dozen or so different types of killer whales that are known as ecotypes. And ecotypes are geographically distinct forms that you find in certain areas. And occasionally they have overlapping ranges. And so ecotypes, they differ in their appearance, in their behavior, in what they eat, their genetics, their vocalizations, a whole assortment of different traits. And they generally don't interact or have anything to do with one another. And so here in the Pacific Northwest, the west coast of North America, or just the North Pacific in general, we have three known ecotypes. We have resident killer whales, transient or Biggs killer whales, and offshore killer whales. And we won't talk about offshores in this presentation because they're not seen very often by really anybody. But instead we'll focus on the two primary ecotypes, the resident killer whales and the transient and Biggs killer whales. So the resident ecotype, these whales tend to travel in large family groups. They're very family oriented. There's no dispersal. So when a whale is born into a family, even when it's an adult, it's going to remain in that same family, which is pretty rare in the animal kingdom. And they are exclusively fish eaters. The majority of their diet is made up of salmon, specifically Chinook salmon, but they will occasionally eat other species like flatfish as well, but they don't eat marine mammals. In over 5 decades of research, they've never been documented actually consuming a marine mammal, just fish. And the transient or Biggs killer whale, they're kind of the opposite of resident killer whales. While they also live in family groups, they live in much smaller groups, usually around 3 to 5 whales in a group. And they're not as loud or as chatty or as boisterous as the resident killer whales, and that's for a good reason. And that reason is that they're mammal hunters. So these are the whales that are hunting things like porpoises, seals, sea lions, occasionally larger baleen whales like minke whales. And they have to remain quiet and stealthy because, unlike fish, marine mammals have a really good sense of hearing and they can easily detect a killer whale that's trying to hunt them. And so these are the two different types that we'll primarily focus on this evening. So right now, there's no algorithm yet that matches killer whales. Every match that's done has to be done manually. And so when you upload photos of killer whales to Happy Whale, there is somebody behind a computer that does it all by eye, and that person is actually me. So for the last almost 2 years, I guess now, I've been doing the identification of killer whales that get uploaded to Happy Whale. So when you submit your photos, they get assigned to me, and I'll look through them and I'll do my best to figure out which population you saw and which individual killer whales that you saw. So for resident killer whales, one cool thing about Happy Whale is that you can look up a map of sightings specific to a species. And so this is a map on Happy Whale that shows all of the resident killer whale sightings that have been recorded. And so we can see that there's a lot concentrated around Southeast Alaska and also the Gulf of Alaska. And these are actually all represent different populations. So here in Alaska, when you see a resident killer whale, what you're going to be seeing most likely is a whale from the Southern Alaska resident population. And that's a population of about 1,000 whales that ranges from Kodiak Island down to Southeast Alaska. And so that's the bulk of the sightings that we have here on Happy Whale around Southeast Alaska and the Gulf. Those are the Southern Alaska residents. There's also the Northern residents. So this is a different population. And if you live in Southeast Alaska, around the Ketchikan area, these are the whales that you probably are seeing. So they range from Southern Southeast Alaska down to Northern Washington, and they spend a lot of their time around the coast of British Columbia as well. And so they're a smaller population of around 300 and 350 or so different whales. And finally, we have the Southern residents. And these are the most endangered of the resident populations. I think their numbers stand somewhere around 73 or 74 at the moment. And they're primarily found around British Columbia, Washington State, but they do range as far south as California, as you can see here on the map. That's actually a sighting of the Southern residents. And on very, very rare occasions, they might poke their heads up into Southeast Alaska, but that does not happen very often. And so if you're around the Washington area or Southern British Columbia area, those are the resident killer whales that you probably would be seeing. And there are other resident populations in the North Pacific over near Russia and even Japan, but there's not much known about those ones yet, and there's not that many sightings of them on Happy Whale. So for our transient or Biggs killer whales, we can also pull up a map on Happy Whale that shows us just sightings of those. And the distribution is a little bit different for these compared to the resident killer whales. So there's, again, different populations of transient killer whales that we can find here in the North Pacific. We have the Gulf of Alaska transients, which, as their name implies, they tend to hang out in the Gulf of Alaska. There's around 100 or so whales in this population. They're not seen very often. The areas where they're seen most frequently would be areas like around Homer, Seward, over in Kodiak. And down in Southeast, before we get to Southeast Alaska, we also have the AT1 transients, or Chugach transients. And there's only 7 whales in this population now. Unfortunately, the Exxon Valdez oil spill really took a toll on their already small population. And these whales are found exclusively in Prince William Sound and the Kenai Fjords region. So you won't see them in any other location, even within Alaska. And unfortunately, since their population is so small and it's aging, those ones are going to go extinct probably within the next 10 to 20 years. Then we have the West Coast transients, which represent the bulk of the sightings that we have on Happy Whale. And their sightings are concentrated around Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, and Washington. And so if you're in the Southeast Alaska region and you see a transient killer whale, you're looking at a West Coast transient most likely. This is a population of around 300 or so transient killer whales that ranges from Southeast Alaska all the way down to the West Coast, where we also have California transients. And so, as their name implies, they are seen primarily off the coast of California, but they've also been seen up around Washington and even in Southeast Alaska in some rare cases. And they are probably a subset of the West Coast transient population. So when you upload your photos of killer whales to Happy Whale, like I mentioned before, they get assigned to me and I go through them. And this is an example of what it looks like on my end. So these are my own photos that I went through and put identifications for. And so what I do is I go through and I look for things like saddle patch pigmentation. Do these whales have any notches in their fin? What ecotype are they? Where were they seen? All of that information helps me figure out which whales you saw. So if you look on the Happy Whale website, they have some fun records that are listed under the stats section. And I wanted to talk about these a little bit because I think they're really interesting. And they're a great example of how, people like you and me out working, looking at whales on boats can really find some fascinating stuff. So the longest time between sightings of a whale on Happy Whale is 41 years. So this is a humpback whale that was seen off the coast of Nova Scotia in 1979, and it was not seen or documented again until last year in 2020. This is a great example of how permanent that pigmentation pattern is on the flukes. If you compare these two photos, even though they're 4 decades apart, we can see that the pigmentation pattern basically didn't change. It might have picked up a couple of algae layers near the base of the flukes, but apart from that, that's the same whale. And I think that's a great example of how consistent those pigmentation patterns are. And so the record for farthest distance traveled, that is almost 7,000 miles. So this is a map citing 3 sightings of one individual humpback whale. It doesn't really have a great nickname, but it's definitely a very interesting whale. So this whale has been seen in the Northern Mariana Islands, down here in the Western Pacific. It's been seen up in Russia and across the ocean over in Mexico. And that's pretty incredible because humpback whales, a little bit of a rundown on their ecology is they spend their summers feeding in cold, high latitude waters like around Alaska, Russia, the Arctic, and then down south in the Antarctic and other colder regions in the southern hemisphere. So they spend their summers fattening up and eating. And then in the wintertime, they will migrate down to warm tropical waters where they breed and they give birth. And they're creatures of habit, humpback whales. Generally, they'll return to the same feeding grounds and breeding grounds every year. So to see one whale jump across an ocean like this is pretty unusual. But again, it's a great example of how photo ID can really give insight into those individual movement patterns of a whale. And so for the most cited individual whale on Happy Whale, that award goes to Flame, the humpback whale, who's been seen, as of today, 228 times. When I actually made this presentation about a week or 2 ago, it was a much lower number, but I double checked again today and it had gone up. So people have uploaded more sightings of her since I made this. And if you've ever been whale watching in Southeast Alaska around Juneau, there's a good chance that you've seen this whale. She goes back to Juneau every summer. She's well known and she's well loved by the researchers and whale watchers in that area. And I believe it was a few years ago, she was even named the Employee of the Year by one of the whale watching companies because she is so consistent and reliable. And she's just a joy to watch. This is a photo I took myself. I've seen her several times down in Juneau. So again, a great example of how photo ID and people uploading their photos, participating in community science can really give us insight into individual whales' lives. So how do you take a good ID photo? You know, when you're out and about on a whale watching trip with a company, or maybe just even out on your own boat, the next time you might want to consider trying to get a good photo of a humpback whale that you can upload to Happy Whale. And Happy Whale is pretty powerful. It can identify whales in even pretty poor quality photos, but it's always best, I think, to give it something good to work with. So this is an example of what would be a pretty good ID photo for a humpback whale. You can see both sides of the flukes really clearly. It's a good angle, so it's not totally head on, but it's pretty close, and you can really see both sides. You can see all of the details because it's a pretty good quality photo as well. And with a humpback whale, you really want to try to get as much of the flukes in that photo as you can. Sometimes you can make IDs based off of, you know, one half of a fluke or just the tip of one, but it's always better to try to get the whole fluke in the frame if you can. And for killer whales, this is an example of what a good ID photo for a killer whale looks like. It's taken from the left side, and I specify the left side because that is traditionally the standard side of the animal that scientists photograph when they're researching killer whales. So most if not all killer whale photo ID catalogs use the left side. Some of them will include the right and left, but left side is standard. So if you can, you want to try to aim for the left side of the animal. And you want to make sure that the saddle patch is clearly visible in the photo. That saddle patch is really key for making IDs of killer whales. And sometimes if it's a distinct looking whale, you can do it based off of the dorsal fin alone. But for whales that have very plain looking dorsal fins that don't have any notches or unique features, you really need to see the saddle patch to be able to make a good ID. And again, you want to try to work with stuff that's of higher quality that makes it easier to see those fine details like these scars and scrape marks right here. And another thing, if you're out photographing whales in your own boat, you want to make sure you're always abiding by whale watching guidelines and regulations. So NOAA, on their website, they have some good guidelines to follow if you're out watching whales, and that includes things like keeping 100 yards distance, not approaching the whales head on or directly behind, maintaining a slow, steady speed, not spending more than 30 minutes with the animals. You know, we want to get good photos and get good data of them, but we don't want to stress them out in the process. And you also want to check into any local laws or guidelines because sometimes there are more specific regulations in an area that might be a little bit more strict. And so you want to make sure you're always following the applicable laws and guidelines. So why does it matter if we know who whales are as individuals? Well, we've talked about how it's good from a scientific standpoint, but it's also good, in my opinion, for conservation and for education and outreach. So I worked as a naturalist on a whale watching boat, a wildlife tour boat, for 4 years. And I really got to know the whales that we were seeing in the area. So for example, in the right photo, this is a humpback whale that I know is Pirate. She comes back to Kachemak Bay every single year. She has this kind of quirky habit of having perfectly timed dives. We sometimes would call her the 5-minute whale because her dives were almost always 5 minutes exactly on the dot. We would even get out a stopwatch and time it. And it was incredible, the accuracy of her timing. In the photo on the left, these are a group of killer whales. The 3 in the front are from a pod known as AP pod. That's another group of killer whales that I've really gotten to know pretty well over the last few years. I know their personalities, their habits, their quirks, simply just from being able to identify them and being able to know who I'm looking at. And I can tell you that it makes a world of a difference when you're working with people who've never seen whales before. When you can point to a whale and say, hey, that's AP11, or that humpback whale's name is Pirate. And you can tell them about these whales as individuals, and it makes a difference. People become a lot more engaged, they become a lot more interested, and they're more willing to care about the humpback whale named Pirate that they saw on their trip to Alaska than just the nameless whale that they saw swim by their boat. And so I really, really love platforms like Happy Whale that allow people to get involved with research themselves without having to be a scientist. You don't need to have a degree or years of experience to help with whale research. You just need a camera. And I think that's one of the coolest things ever. And so with that, I guess if anybody has questions, I'm happy to take them. Oh, I think you're muted.
Great. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. This was awesome. I have definitely learned a lot. I love the facts where you can see how long it's been since they've been seen, or like where they've been traveling, like that one whale that goes to Russia. So thank you. I know I have a couple questions, but if others also have questions, now is your time to throw them into the chat and we will get them answered. Somebody did have a comment about using the left side to ID killer whales, and I did have a question on that. Why is the left side preferred?
I don't think there's really a good reason. I mean, right side is just as fine. I think that was just kind of the side they arbitrarily picked back when they started doing photo ID, and then it just kind of became the standard. But more often I'm seeing now a lot of researchers are making catalogs that have left and right side ID shots. And even now people are actually starting to use the eye patches of killer whales. So I mean, this picture that I have here at the end, I mean, even the eye patches are unique to every whale. So some catalogs are now starting to include those as well. So you can even ID a whale from that population if it just sticks its head out of the water. You don't even need to see the saddle patch in some cases. So yeah, it's just kind of an arbitrary choice.
Right, that makes sense. Let's see here. Where does the funding for Happy Whale come from?
Oh, that's a good question. I know they get grants occasionally, so they just got a grant that they're going to use to study the relationships between humpback whales. So they want to look into how individual whales are interacting with each other and if they're forming things like bonds or friendships over time. And so they got grant money to do that. But that'd be a great question for the founder, Ted Cheeseman, who I think is actually in here watching somewhere. But I do know they get some grant money.
Awesome. Aaron says, Emma or Ted, how many orca photos would Happy Whale like? Should we be promoting submissions of southern resident killer whales and bigs to Happy Whale at this time?
I mean, I'm always happy when I log on and I see more submissions that I get to look through. Personally, I just really like doing it. I think it's always, more data, the better. I know specifically for like the southern residents and big killer whales, a lot of those sightings get submitted to the research groups that document them. So like the Center for Whale Research, or the people that work with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So I would say, always forward those photos on to them, but also feel free to put them on Happy Whale. I mean, I'll look at them, I'll identify them if I can. So the more the merrier.
Yeah. All right. Someone named Ivy said, hello. I was wondering how you can tell the pigmentation changed over the course of a couple of years when it's not algae.
Okay, so is the question asking does the pigmentation pattern change? And if it does, how can you tell?
I
Um,
think it seems to be more of like, how can you tell? Or yes, she said yes.
okay, so for the adult humpback whales, um, their pigmentation patterns really don't change. So it's pretty set in stone. Now, when they're calves, it gets a little bit trickier. So a humpback whale calf, its pigmentation pattern isn't very clear, and they tend to have flukes that look a little bit kind of hazy. So you might be able to tell like a hint of what it might look like, but from when they're a calf to when they're an adult, it can change pretty rapidly as they're maturing. So it can be kind of hard to tell to re-identify a whale as an adult when you saw it as a calf, but it can be done. Um, But once they're adults, it generally doesn't change. So when you're looking at the algae on the flukes, it's just going to be like a yellowish brown layer, and it's going to be distinct from the black and white patterns that you see, because humpback whales, they don't have any yellow pigmentation on them. So that's how you would tell the algae from the natural pigmentation patterns.
Awesome. She said thank you. Um, I had another question that could be happy whale related. I've heard of the beluga that's been down in the Puget Sound, and has that been getting recorded pretty frequently to happy whale? Was that like a big surprise? Did you see
I
it first?
I haven't looked to see if it's been uploaded to Happy Whale because I don't do any beluga sightings. Belugas can be really hard for photo ID. I've tried to do it myself. I've photographed the belugas out in Cook Inlet, right near where I live, and it's hard because they don't have dorsal fins, and you have to basically rely on any light scarring patterns you might see on their back. Um, and the last I heard, NOAA and some other research organizations, they were trying to see if they could match that beluga to one of the known belugas in a catalog up here in Alaska. I don't think they have yet, as far as I know. I don't think that beluga's been seen again for a few days. But I'd like to know where it came from. If it was one of the whales that we have up here or from somewhere else, who knows?
Yeah, that was quite a shocking arrival to to have still down there. That was quite a surprise. Yeah, and they are very hard. I have tried, and it's never been quite successful. Another question from Mary: do whales look different as they age? How long do whales live?
No, it's a great question. Um, I mean, in terms of age, not really. A really old orca that's like 60 years old pretty much looks the same as one that's 20. But the lifespan can differ depending on the species. So for killer whales, the average lifespan for a female killer whale is going to be around 50 years. They can live up into their 70s, 80s, maybe 90s, but the average is about 50. Now, for male killer whales, it's a little bit less. It's around 30 years on average, but they might be able to live up into their 50s or 60s as a maximum. Now, for humpback whales, I want to say it's somewhere between 50 to 60 years old, um, but you really can't quite tell how old they are just from looking at them. You would have to age them in a different way, either by knowing that whale from when it was born, and that's the case for many killer whales nowadays. Scientists, in some cases, they've seen them on the day they were born, so they know their exact birthday. Or you can get ages from them by doing studies on things like their baleen, which of course is only possible if you get an individual that washes up. So it can be kind of tricky to tell how old they are unless you've been around long enough to see when they were born, or if you have a chance to actually examine their body after death.
Are there any other questions? You can throw them in. I had another question. But yeah, I'll make room for all the questions that come in if more come in. The difference between subspecies and ecotype. is it primarily that they're geographically isolated? But I know there are some ecotypes that overlap. So
Mhm.
do you know what specifics might be that differentiate those two? So between subspecies and ecotype?
Depends on who you ask. That really gets back to the whole what's a species and what's not conundrum. I know specifically with killer whales, you've got kind of two camps of people. You've got people who, they'll think that residents and transients are different species, which I'm one of those. I think they're two different species, one step above subspecies. Um, but the actual difference between a subspecies and an ecotype, a subspecies is an official taxonomic level, an ecotype is an informal one. So they're kind of the same thing, in my opinion. Just one is official and one's not in the world of taxonomy. But killer whales, particularly, are so diverse. I think there are probably different species, different subspecies. I know what kind of throws people off when it comes to killer whales is there are types that live in the same area. They have overlapping ranges like residents and transients, but they generally don't ever interact or interbreed. And when you think of like the species question, usually a species arises when you have something like a physical barrier or a geographic barrier or something like that. But these are whales that are existing side by side, but they've managed to differentiate probably through cultural means rather than something else. And so I think that is kind of where the argument lies. Do we split them? Do we not split them? I say split them, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same camp. And someone named Aaron again said it's a can of worms.
Yeah.
Natalie asked, how are whales officially nicknamed? As a naturalist, I agree a name makes them more interesting to first-time whale watchers.
That's a great question. It depends on the population and where you're at. So, like down in Washington with like the southern resident killer whales, there's a very like kind of official way of doing it. So in Washington, the Whale Museum in San Juan Island, they hold a naming contest for newborn killer whales in that population. People can submit names, and then people can vote on them, and then that's how the names are chosen. Sometimes they're chosen through First Nations people, Indigenous people in the U.S. too. Other places, it kind of varies. I know some places, like in Iceland, research groups will just have like a naming contest. People can suggest names and they'll vote on them. Other places, the researchers themselves will give nicknames to the whales. So like up here in Alaska, the killer whales not all of them have nicknames, but a lot of them do. And those names come from the North Gulf Oceanic Society's researchers, and they typically name them after physical locations where they're seen fairly often. For humpback whales, I've named a couple myself just because that's what I started calling them on the boat, and then that's just kind of the nickname that got adopted. And I think on Happy Whale, I'd have to look at this again, but there is an option on a tab where you can actually click on it. It says name your whale or name a whale, and there's some information there about how you can go about naming a whale on Happy Whale. So it differs, but I know nicknaming whales is kind of a fun thing to do in the whale watching community.
What are a couple that you have named?
Well, the one I mentioned a couple times, Pirate, I named that humpback whale. I always call her she. I'm pretty sure it's actually a male. I don't really know. It's hard to tell. But I chose that name because the X on the fluke reminded me of like a X on a treasure map.
Yeah.
And like with humpback whales, I know a lot of them, they tend to get named like based on the markings on their flukes, like what they might look like. And then there's another whale I named Lightning based on like a line on the fluke, look like a lightning bolt. I think, I have one whale that's named after me. There's one humpback whale named Luck, and the Ginger Moore, who maintains the catalog of humpbacks in Kachemak Bay, she wanted to name that one after me since I was the first one to document it in Homer. So that's kind of,
Yeah, not many
there's,
people can say they all named after them or that they've named whales. That's incredible.
yeah, it's fun. I like it. You know, it's fun to look at the flukes of a humpback whale and try to find like a shape or a pattern or of something that you can give it a nickname based off of.
Yeah, that's so fun. Awesome. That's so cool. A little bit envious. We have another question, and then that might be our conclusion for the evening. Why are killer whales called killer whales?
Ooh, great question. I like this question because it's kind of a heated debate depending on who you ask. Once again, killer whales, they got their name quite some time ago, back in the days of whaling, and they were called whale killers. I think it was in the Spanish language, and because whalers would see these whales, these orcas, they would go after and they would be killing large baleen whales, and so they called them whale killers. And then eventually, throughout time in English, that got flipped around to killer whale. Now we also have the nickname orca, which comes from their scientific name, Orcinus orca, and that one has a little bit fuzzier name origins, but they're not super nice. You know, I've seen some translations say things like demon from hell or belonging to Orcus, the god of the underworld. So there's, heated debate. Do we call them orcas? Do we call them killer whale? I say call them whatever you want. Neither name is better nor worse than the other. And I think they're both fine names to use personally.
That's great. Goes way back. That's interesting. Yeah. I know there's also a debate between their orcas or if they're dolphins or whales, or if whales are dolphins and dolphins are, I know
they're both.
That's another. I know. Depends who you ask. I know it's another can of worms, but yeah. So thank you on the killer whale name clarification. Great. Well, I think that's all we have for right now. I just want to extend a big thank you. If anyone else has a thank you, feel free to throw it in the chat, or if you know Emma, you can reach out to her later on. But I do want to say again, thank you so much to our members for making this a free presentation. And thank you so much to Emma, because this was all on her own time. She put this presentation together and spent time with us this evening volunteering. And so we just are so grateful for your time, Emma, and for sharing all that you clearly have such a big passion for. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I had tons of fun. Great, thanks. I'm going to stop recording right now.